Mr. McClintock, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Three numbers describe everything that there is to know about the federal budget: 26, 29, and 46. 26% is the combined growth of population inflation over the past 10 years. 29% is the increase in revenues. So to Mr. Yarmouth's point, our revenues have been doing very well. The third number is killing us. 46% is the growth of spending over these past 10 years. Over those 10 years, the spending's doubled our debt, which now exceeds $21 trillion. Just paying the interest on the debt costs us $475 billion a year. That is the fastest growing component of the federal budget. On our current path, within 3 years, interest on the debt will exceed what we spend on the entire military establishment of this country. Because we carry so much debt, a 1% increase in interest rates will cost us $200 billion more in annual interest payments. During 8 of those 10 years, our parties controlled the House, and this government cannot spend a dollar unless the House says it can. Every year, we've been told, well, the budget's aspirational, it's visionary. And we're also told that the real culprit is the mandatory spending dictated by statute that is beyond our control. Well, these are lies. They're lies we tell ourselves as an excuse for avoiding the tough decisions that are getting tougher every year we delay making them. The budget is not a wish list. It is the most powerful operational fiscal control that we have on federal spending. The Budget Committee is supposed to set limits on discretionary and mandatory spending. These limits are real and they are enforceable. The Appropriations Committees cannot exceed the limits we set on the discretionary side. And the limits we set on the mandatory side are supposed to be written into the reconciliation instructions that our authorizing committees are then required to meet. If they don't meet them, the Budget Committee itself can make those changes. Either way, we are responsible for producing a reconciliation bill with all of the required statutory changes to stay within our mandatory limits. It's actually easier to control mandatory spending than it is discretionary spending, because the mandatory spending reductions in the reconciliation bill get expedited consideration in the Senate. But in the 10 years that we've doubled our debt and placed our nation's fiscal affairs in danger of a debt spiral, we've never used this process as it was intended, not once. Rather, we've rubber-stamped what the leadership has already decided to spend and promised mandatory spending reforms next year, always next year. Well, 2 months after the deadline, the budget is now before us for markup. It increases discretionary spending massively to cover the 18% boost in discretionary spending that this Congress decided upon months ago in the absence of a budget. Then it aspires to drop dramatically to a responsible trajectory by promising the same reforms we have failed to enact year after year. If we're serious about the mandatory reforms, we'd put them in the reconciliation instructions and force the statutory changes necessary to make them. We would include discretionary limits that would begin the trajectory back toward balance in this year's budget. Now, to its credit, the budget does include $300 billion of mandatory reductions over the decade. But we depend on $8 trillion in order to balance the budget over these 10 years. The problem is we don't mean it. If we meant it, those would all go into the reconciliation instructions. All this means that in 10 years, our national debt will be $33.5 trillion instead of $33.8 trillion. Neither number matters because neither path is sustainable. We won't get there. We're now on a fool's errand to reform the budget process. Well, I have news for you, Mr. Chairman. Changing the process isn't going to make these decisions any easier. Whatever the process, the decisions are going to get harder and harder every year that we don't make them. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. The only argument for this budget is that even though it makes no change in our current discretionary spending and only a trivial change in our mandatory spending, well, $300 billion of mandatory reductions over a decade is better than nothing. That's the issue I'm still grappling with. Is it better to get $300 billion in reconciliation instructions, even though we know it will make no significant difference in the fiscal crisis that every year looms closer and closer because of sham budgets? I suppose it is, but unfortunately it doesn't matter. You know, countries that bankrupt themselves aren't around very long, and I think we're running out of time, and sadly, I don't see this budget getting serious about changing course. The changes that it recommends are excellent ones, but they're not meaningful because they're not written into the reconciliation instructions. They're just a promise for reform that we've made and broken the 10 years that I've been here, and I find that very disappointing. I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio is